With the deadline for a U.S. government default quickly approaching, leaders on Capitol Hill remain in a holding pattern until after Speaker Kevin McCarthy's meeting with President Biden at the White House this coming Tuesday. Now, the president insists he will not negotiate, but House Republicans backed him into a corner when they united to pass the Limit, Save, Grow Act, which raises the debt ceiling while also saving $130 billion in the budget. Now, this week, business groups and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce urged President Biden to reach a deal with Republicans. Well, the question is he ready to negotiate? Is he listening? Joining me now to discuss this and more is Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota. He serves on 4 Senate committees, including the Senate Banking Committee and, as I mentioned, the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator Cramer, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Tony, it's good to be with you, although I'm hoping you can hear me.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Good. I hear you fine. Thank you. It's great to be with you, and you teed it up perfectly. I mean, what, 65 or more percent of the American people think it's only reasonable that Joe Biden negotiate with the Republican majority in the House of Representatives. My sense is that he understands that he's got to do that, and that this burden is really now on him, quite honestly, this burden of a potential default of our national debt.
So, Senator, is the president playing chicken with House Republicans here, just refusing to sit down and meet in the middle?
Well, Tony, what I always say about negotiations is if all or nothing is your beginning point, that's fine. But it can't be your ending point, because an all or nothing ending point is oftentimes nothing. So, this guy, you say what you want about Joe Biden, he's got a lot of experience in transactional politics. I would certainly hope that this isn't the time that he decides to play chicken with the national debt. That said, I do think people should have a clear understanding of how reasonable Kevin McCarthy and the House Republicans have been in their offering. They've actually passed a bill that would raise the debt ceiling. And yes, some of those conditions that go along with it are going to be hard for the left to swallow. But boy, they're not exactly radical conditions. Things like, a discretionary cap of 2022 spending as the new starting point, and then a small 1% incremental growth throughout the next several years. Tony, I don't know, but 1% growth is not a cut. That's growth. Some work requirements, modest work requirements for able-bodied people that are on government assistance programs. Again, why not help lift people up rather than, keep them under the thumb of the government? And then, of course, there's some permitting reform in their H.R. 1, which enhances the economic opportunities, which will grow the government coffers with some refining of permitting in this country to build the things. And none of it's very radical. So I'm going to be optimistic, Tony. I'm always optimistic that Joe Biden's going to come to the negotiating table and that they'll find enough common ground to make a deal.
Senator, we're seeing kind of the grandma in the wheelchair going over the cliff again, where those types of over the top language. When in fact, if you actually read what's been proposed, it's Congress that will determine where the money goes. This does not cut Social Security, does not cut Medicare, and it's up to the Congress to decide how to spend the resources that we have available.
Well, our Constitution is pretty clear on that point, for sure, Tony. And then the fact that, that this overplaying their hand all the time, this is what discredits them so often. I get it, in the early going, maybe a little political jabbing here and there, but then you got to get serious about it, remembering that Social Security and Medicare have been off the table for Republicans and Democrats for a long time. Now, I'm a Republican that thinks we ought to start dealing with it. We should have started dealing with it a long time ago, with regard to both the revenue side as well as the spending side of those mandatory spending programs, because they're going to be defaulting themselves here in a few short years, at which point there'll be automatic budget cuts. But for this discussion and this purpose and this negotiation, they're off the table. We're talking about the discretionary side of the budget. So we've got to look out for national defense and then put some guardrails in on the spending. That should not be an unreasonable thing. And by the way, Tony, I think it's really important for people to understand. A lot of people conflate raising the debt ceiling with a government shutdown. not raising the debt ceiling doesn't create a government shutdown. It just forces the government to only spend the money that they're taking in every day. What a novel approach that would be. And before people think that's going to be some catastrophic crisis, just notice we're in a crisis. We have high inflation, high interest rates. We have open borders. We have a supply chain crisis that's squelching our economy, and we have an anemic economic growth, 1.1% the last quarter, probably heading to recession. Bank failures. We've got plenty of problems. And how about just staying within our means for a while? That might send a good market signal as opposed to a bad one that everyone else expects.
Senator Cramer, we often see this, but in the proposed or the spending that we saw put forward last month or last year, where they expanded the tax credits for energy tax credits and all of this, now that's created a lobbying group that's lobbying for these, saying this is going to kill jobs. And this really tells us why, government programs and spending never go away, because they create these constituencies that lobby for the continued spending, regardless of the fact that it's driving the nation further into debt.
No, a very important point, Tony. Every time you start a program, you start an incentive, you create some sort of a financial incentive, and it automatically creates a constituency if it didn't already have one, and that constituency becomes a lobbying stakeholder. And I get all of that. But what person in business that's serious about business doesn't understand that we simply can't run up the nation's debt, individual debt, and then somehow they're going to be okay. Ultimately, you've got to make a product that people want. You have to have a willing seller and a willing buyer. But if the willing buyer doesn't have any money, they can't buy it from you. So it's often disappointing to me that corporate America turns so quickly toward government largesse rather than a good free market system.
So how do you see this playing out, Senator Cramer?
Yeah. So it's an important question because I'm not sure how it's going to play out, but I will say this for now. Republicans in the United States Senate are standing 100% with the Republicans in the United States House of Representatives and Kevin McCarthy. We are cheering him on. He knows we have his back. He has drawn the line in the sand. The ball is in Joe Biden's court. If the two of them don't agree on something, then they're not going to get the rest of us to agree on something. The way I think it plays out is that Joe Biden wakes up and realizes he's playing chicken with the wrong guy, and it's time to roll up our shirt sleeves. Whatever they come up with, Tony, clearly isn't going to be something that every Republican loves, and it's not going to be something every Democrat loves. But we have a divided government, a wonderful opportunity to test this magnificent system that our founders gave us and find both common ground and then compromise. And when that happens, instead of having 218 Republican votes and, 51 Democratic votes in the Senate and maybe nine Republicans, I think what they're going to find is maybe there's 180 Republican votes and 80 Democratic votes, or maybe it's even split more evenly than that. And you're going to get a more durable outcome. And I think that's exactly what our founders had in mind when they put this system together. But we just have to we have to start getting our job done much, much sooner. We're coming up on this cliff, as you know, much sooner than anybody anticipated, because Janet Yellen suddenly said, wait a minute, it's not going to be August 1st, it's going to be June 1st that we run out of money. And the reason for it, Tony, that one of the reasons she gave was that the revenue coming in on April 15th from income taxes wasn't what they expected. Well, imagine that. We're in a recession, we're in high inflation, and there's all the other things I said earlier, a supply chain challenge. And so we need to get our entire economic ship in order.
And I would add to that the regulations choking off business and economic growth. Amen. Senator, always great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today. Have a great weekend.
Always my pleasure. Thank you, Tony. You too.